Hello everyone, also from my side, thank you all for coming. Today's talk, other than the talk by Sebastian and Pascal last month, will not deal with the concept of or behind data linking, but rather will present an empirical application of data linking techniques. So what I'm presenting here today is an empirical study that uses data linking to answer a substantive research question, in particular to explain political trust. And the study I'm talking about today has actually already been published earlier this year. And as this Meet the Expert series deals with obviously data linking in particular, I'm not going to go into too much detail about the theory and the prior research and also on the results of my empirical paper. But if you're interested in those, please do feel free to look it up in the published article, which is available open access. So what am I interested in? What am I trying to answer here? Well, I'm interested in the link between political losing, the quality of elections, and political trust. And this stems from a number of different directions. So on the one hand, in the past couple of years, we've witnessed an increasing polarization between different political factions and also a growing gap between the winners and losers of elections. And when I talk of winners and losers of election, what I'm referring to is not the parties that may have won or lost the election, but rather the citizens who voted for those parties. So those who voted for a party that ended up in government, that's the winners, and those who voted for a party that ended up in the opposition, those are the losers I'm talking about. And for those losers in particular, we've also seen that those tend to be rather unhappy with the democratic system, so they're not really thrilled that they lost the election, and they tend to apply this also to the entire democratic system. At the same time, political science in the last maybe decade has developed a rather large debate about electoral integrity, about electoral processes. And this revolves around both the concept of electoral integrity, also its measurement, but also some empirical studies. And those empirical studies, they've shown that all around the world, we find deficiencies in the electoral process. And this is the case not only in autocracies where, of course, by the very definition of autocracy, you wouldn't expect a flawless democratic electoral process, but it's also the case in democracies and even in liberal democracies. So, I mean, just think of the recent electoral debacle here in Berlin in Germany. And so I look at these kind of developments and I ask myself the question, well, what does it do to the functioning of democracy? Is this in any way problematic for the functioning of democracy? And because I do come from research on political attitudes, I look at political attitudes as an outcome, and in particular on political trust, because political trust is one of the most consequential attitudes for the functioning and also the stability of democracy. And this has to do with the role of political trust in determining political behavior. So political trust, for example, has been found to affect whether or not people obey the laws, whether or not they pay their taxes, whether or not they vote for anti-system parties, and actually basically whether or not they try to sort of overturn the system and start a revolution. So political trust is really a key variable here, and I'm interested in how political trust is affected by losing an election and how this interacts with the actual quality of this election. Now, I said it before, I'm going to be fairly brief on the theory, but I will talk a bit about, and I need to talk a bit about my theoretical expectations for this paper. So, as a first step, there's a fairly basic finding that election losers tend to be, and I said this before, less happy with the government that results from the election that they lost. And this is quite obvious, and it has utilitarian as well as psychological reasons. So utilitarian reason for this would be that if you vote for a party, you typically choose a party that you expect to implement policies that are in your favor or policies that you prefer. So if the party you voted for ends up not in government, but rather in opposition, then the government parties are normally parties that you would expect to implement policies that aren't as much in your favor as the party you would have preferred to win the election. So there's a reason to expect that you have less utilitarian benefits from a party that you didn't vote for than from a party that you voted for. So you will probably be less happy with what this government does if you didn't vote for this government in the first place. But there's also psychological reasons behind being unhappy with the resulting government. And basically, it's a very human nature thing that humans just really don't like losing. We are unhappy when we lose. It elicits an emotional response from us, and we are, as a result, less satisfied with the results of whatever game it is we lost in. So those who lost in elections are less likely to be satisfied with the government results from this election. And at the same time, the incumbent government is known to actually shape how the political system itself is perceived. And this has to do with the government being obviously a representative, arguably the most important representative, the most central representative of the entire political system. And so if we take these two things together, we find, or we can expect, that political losing decreases political trust indirectly through satisfaction with the incumbent government. So people lose the election, they're less satisfied with the incumbent government, and then they sort of generalize their feelings towards the government, towards the entire political system, and express less trust of the system. So that's my first expectation. There's also another expectation on how losing affects political trust. Again, this is an indirect effect, but this one is mediated through perceptions of electoral fairness. So the idea behind this is, and there's plenty of research that shows us that those who lost the election, they tend to perceive the electoral process as less fair than those who won the election. And again, this has to do also with psychological reasons. If you lost in a game, you tend to believe that the game was somehow rigged against you. You didn't lose because you were like in favor of the less deserving party, but you lost because, well, the game was rigged. While if you won the elections, you like to believe that you won fair and square. It wasn't an unfair election, the game wasn't rigged in your favor, but rather your party was just a superior choice. So this is the first step of this indirect effect. And then this is followed by perceptions of electoral fairness actually affecting political trust. Again, there's lots of empirical evidence that this is the case, and there's a good theoretical reason for it as well. Because, as I said before, in democracies, a free and fair electoral process, it's a key definition of democracy. That's what makes a democracy, is having free and fair elections. So free and fair elections are sort of the key rules of the games in a democracy. So if these key rules are violated, that violates the basics of democracy. And so you would expect people who think the electoral process was unfair to also think that the entire political system is kind of illegitimate and that they can't trust the political institutions. And again, if we take those two steps together, we will expect that political losing first decreases or elicits more negative perceptions of electoral fairness, and then in turn decreases political trust. Now, coming to the role of the electoral process itself, or rather electoral integrity. So, of course, on the one hand, actual integrity will always affect also how people perceive the electoral fairness. In general, we would expect that if the electoral process itself was more fair, then people, ceteris paribus, will also think that it was more fair or perceive it as more fair. But that's not what I'm interested in here. What I'm interested in here is the moderating effect of electoral integrity on the linkage between political losing and political trust. And what I expect is that the second indirect effect I was just explaining, so the one that's mediated through perceptions of electoral integrity, that this is conditional on the electoral integrity. So why is that the case? There isn't a whole lot of theory on this, but there's this paper by Peter Esaisan that's really instrumental or instructive for this one, because he identifies 4 conditions for losers in elections to react well to being defeated in this election. And by reacting well, what he means is that people accept the electoral outcome and they don't put into doubt the entire process. While the first one, that has to do with utility from a peaceful solution, isn't relevant in our case, the second, third, and fourth one actually do bear some relevance for our argument here. So Esaisan argues that for losers to react well to defeat, they need to feel like they're being involved in the decision-making process, they need to consider the system of government itself as legitimate, and they need to have the impression that they can win the next time. And all 3 of these conditions, in some form and to some extent, hinge on the actual quality of the election. So if electoral quality is high, people can have more of a feeling that they're being involved in the decision-making process. They can actually consider the system of government itself as more legitimate, and they can have, they're more likely to have the impression that they have a fair chance of winning the next time. While if the actual electoral integrity is low, then people are less likely to feel this way. So they're more likely not to react well, but rather to doubt the entire integrity of the process. And this is actually amplified for losers because of the psychological reasons for trying to sort of make up for losing. So to sum this up, maybe my expectation is that in contexts where electoral quality is high, neither losers nor winners have much reason to doubt the actual electoral process. So there won't be much of a difference between winners and losers in how they perceive the electoral fairness. But in conditions where there is actually some problems with the electoral process, those who lost the elections, they will look much more closely to those problems and they will sort of over-exaggerate or over-amplify those problems, while those who won the election, they tend to sort of underestimate those problems, look over those problems because they want to believe that the election was free. So there will be much more of an effect of losing on perceptions of electoral fairness. Now, coming to the sort of heart of this presentation today is the data part. And so, as I said before, what I'm interested in here is the link between citizen attitudes, political trust, and a sort of latent institutional trait, the electoral integrity, as well as a not so latent institutional trait, which is the election outcome. And so what I need to do is I need to link survey data on people's attitudes, on their political trust, with expert assessments of the electoral integrity, and also some additional data on the election outcomes. So in terms of the survey projects, I used the Asian Barometer Survey, the European Social Survey, and the Latinobarómetro. So I used 3 different cross-national survey projects that have the key attitudinal variables I'm interested in, or individual level variables. So that's institutional confidence, political trust. And I look at 4 institutions here. I look at parliament, parties, courts, and police. And they also all contain a variable on vote choice. And for the electoral process, I use the expert assessments provided by the Varieties-of-Democracy project, so the V-Dem data, that have a variable on the quality of the election. Now, before I can use this data, because obviously that's all individual data sets, I need to somehow process them and prepare them for the analysis. And there's 3 particular challenges associated with this process that I'm going to go through one after the other now. So the first one, and I'll be rather brief on this because it's not the main focus of this talk, is the harmonization of the survey data. As I said, I'm using 3 different survey projects, which has one major advantage because it just gives me more countries. So broader geographical scope and more observations on the country level. But it also comes with a couple of disadvantages, which is the question wordings aren't identical across the surveys, and also the response scales, they vary. So while the question wordings, they're actually, fortunately, fairly similar. So all of those 3 survey projects in one way or the other ask, how much confidence do we have in the following institutions? And then it just lists the parties, parliament, courts, and the police, among other institutions. The response scales, they do vary quite a lot. So even though the extremes of the response scales, they're labeled very similarly. So usually the least positive response is like no trust at all, and the most positive one is full trust or full confidence. We do actually have something from a 4-point scale to, I think it's an 11-point scale in the European Social Survey. So what I needed to do before I could actually combine those survey data sets, I needed to linearly transform the response scales. So they all map onto the same value range in the responses. And then I used multi-group confirmatory factor analysis to just check whether the measurement is actually invariant across surveys. So I used latent measurement of political trust, and the MGCFA actually does show that we can compare this measurement across the different surveys, so that gives us a good indication that neither the question wordings nor the response scales have a substantive effect on people's response behaviors. And I'm going to refer you to the paper for more details on this, because this paper was actually part of a special issue on survey data harmonization, so there is quite some additional detail in the paper if you're interested in the harmonization process. Now to the actual focus here is the linking of the survey and the expert data. So as I said before, well, as you know now, I have my now harmonized survey data on the individual level. on the one hand, and on the other hand, I have my expert assessments of electoral integrity at the country year level. So the country year format is the format that V-Dem data comes in, and obviously the surveys come in individual level format. Now, if you have been to Sebastian and Pascal's talk, you might remember that they have identified 4 challenges of survey-based linking. And the issues I have with my data actually refer to the 3rd and the 4th challenges. So I have some questions about the spatial aggregation. I have some problems with the temporal units. In terms of the spatial aggregation, it's not so much about choosing the appropriate level of spatial aggregation, because I don't actually get to choose here. Why don't I get to choose? Well, I only have limited data. The survey data, the surveys, they only ask about people's vote choice and in the last national election, and they only ask about people's perception of the fairness of the last national election. So I don't really have any data on the regional or local election level. So it's clear from the outset that my level of spatial aggregation has to be the national level or has to be the country, which is convenient because that's also the level that the V-Dem data come in. So far, so good. Now what I need to do is to match my individuals in the survey data to their respective countries in the V-Dem data. And fortunately, all of those data sets do have some sort of identifiers for the countries. In the case of V-Dem, that's actually the Correlates of War country codes. Don't know if you're familiar with those, but that's one of the most widely used country classifications, which has the advantage of actually being like sort of backwards compatible through time. So they also have like country codes for countries that don't exist anymore, but that might have or that did exist in previous times. For example, they have like a country code for Yugoslavia as well. So you could use it even for long-term analyses. The surveys, alas, they don't have COW codes, but they all have their own country identifiers. So for example, here the Asian Barometer Survey, what they do is they just numbered every country from 1 to 13 without any obvious order of the countries either. The Latinobarómetro, they use a numbering scheme that I think is derived from the World Value Survey, and that's sort of based on an alphabetical order of country names. And not only Latin American country names, but worldwide country names, and they are also mapped onto some sort of numbering system. So we have something between 32 for Argentina and 862 for Venezuela in this data set. And my absolute favorite one in this case is the European Social Survey, which doesn't even have any numerical codes, but rather has 2-letter string variables to identify countries. And to map those into the COW codes that we have in the V-Dem data, well, it's not terribly intellectually challenging, but it's a bit tedious work because what you have to do is you have to hand recode all the country identifiers to match the COW codes. Once that's done, however, you can actually link the country or the spatial levels here. So we can now match our individuals to their respective countries in the V-Dem data. But I'm not done here because, as I said before, I also need to think about the temporal units. And the temporal units, from a technical point of view, that's fairly simple because I have the interview date in the survey data and I have the year in the V-Dem data. And I can easily extract the year from the interview date. That's not a problem. But I do need to decide which year to actually match with. So which year in the survey data to match with which year in the V-Dem data. And obviously you use the same year, but the question is which year is the one that's relevant. And there's 2 issues with deciding this. So the first one is that national elections don't happen annually typically. So if everything goes as planned, national elections happen every 4 or 5 years in most countries. So we only have a new data point actually for every 4 or 5 years. But what V-Dem does, and that's quite convenient in our case, it simply repeats the value for the most recent election for all the in-between election years. So if you had an election in 2013, the values for 2014, 15, and 16 in the V-Dem dataset will just be the same as for 2013. And then if you have a new election in 2017, that will be a new value. So that's easy. So you don't have any missing values, for example, in the V-Dem data. So you can simply use the survey year for the matching. But there's also an issue with the surveys. And the issue is that the surveys I'm using here, they aren't election studies. And because they aren't election studies, their fieldwork periods aren't aligned with election cycles. And that leads to a number of issues. And to identify those issues, what we first need to do is we actually need to compare our survey fieldwork dates with the election dates to see just what we have here. And the first step then, once we have compiled this list, which is also, again, some work you typically need to do by hand, you need to, well, what I did was exclude the countries that held elections during the survey fieldwork. So, for example, Israel here that held an election in January 2013, which was during the survey fieldwork period of the ESS. Why did I exclude those countries? Well, the problem is that if the election happens during the survey fieldwork period, then we actually have two different elections that different respondents might refer to in their responses to the surveys. And while we could theoretically split the sample, depending on the date of the election, there's a couple of problems that come with that. And the first one is, well, the main problem we have is that it's hard to know who's actually a winner and loser, depending on when the election happened. So on the one hand, before the election, thanks to opinion polls, if it's a very clear-cut election, people might know even before whether their party is going to win or lose the election. But that's not the main problem, because there's still some insecurity attached to this. The main problem is actually after the election. Because, as I said, winners and losers aren't defined by the share of votes they get in the election, which obviously is clear the ones the polls sort of closes, but rather whether or not the party ends up in government. And government formation in today's democracies can take anything from a couple of hours to the better part of a year. And so we don't really know when exactly it's clear who's going to actually be a winner or loser of the election. And to avoid this sort of ambiguity here, I simply excluded the countries that held elections during the survey fieldwork. Luckily, this wasn't too many countries, so it didn't create a major problem. And the other adjustment we need to make concerns those countries that held elections in the same year as the surveys, but after the surveys. So, for example, here in Czechia, they held elections in October 2013, while the ESS fieldwork happened from January to March 2013. And why do we need to make an adjustment here? Well, that's fairly simple, because V-Dem obviously records always the sort of electoral integrity data for the election that happened in that year. So the 2013 V-Dem data, that will refer to the October 2013 election. But people that were surveyed in the spring of 2013, when they were asked who they voted for in the last election and how fair they thought this election was, obviously they're not referring to the election that will happen 9 months later, but rather they refer to the election that happened before that one, in this case in 2010. So we need to adjust the matching year just not to confound the two different elections with each other. So once that is done, actually we have matched our survey data to the expert data on both the spatial level and on the temporal units. So this is done as well. Now on to the third data challenge. Again, there's a linking problem here because, as I said before, I'm interested in obviously who voted for the winning or the losing camp. But the surveys, they don't actually ask, did you vote for a winning or a losing party? They asked, who did you vote for? So I actually need to bring this information, vote choice, together with the official election results, or rather the government composition, to identify whether the party that people voted for was a winning party or a losing party. Fortunately, as a great service, the folks behind the Asian Barometer Survey and the Latinobarómetro, they already do this for us. So once the data sets are released, they actually contain an extra variable that just indicates whether the respondent voted for a winning or a losing party. So there isn't any extra work to be done here. But it is for the European Social Survey because that doesn't contain this extra variable. So what we need to do again is link different types of data. So on the left-hand side, again, we have our survey data, in this case, the vote choice variable. And then we have some data on government composition. There's different sources of this data, but the one I think is most recommendable is the WhoGov data, because as far as I'm aware, this is the most comprehensive data set to date on government composition. So to link these two data sets, again, we need to identify which election is actually the relevant one. So which election are the surveys asking the respondents about, But we've already done this in the previous linking exercise, so that's a check here. And then we need to identify which were actually the winning parties. And maybe a note on the structure of the HUGAF dataset. I don't know if everyone's familiar with that one. So HUGAF comes actually with individual observations for every single government member. So any cabinet member is an individual observation. Then you have the country, the year, and the party affiliation of this person. So what we see here is just a list of all the cabinet members for Belgium in the year 2010. And we can see that the first one is the Prime Minister, who is a member of the Christian Democrats and Flemish Party, but some of their cabinet members are also members of the Party of Liberty and Progress, the Socialist Party, or the Reformist Movement, and some other parties as well. So we have this list of parties that we can extract from this information from HUGAF, so list of government parties, and we need to now map it onto the vote choice responses. And I don't know if you can read it because it's fairly small, but as you can probably see from here, the names in the left table, so the one on the vote choice response categories, they don't always match the names in the HUGAF data because, again, these data sets aren't harmonized to begin with, so they use different abbreviation, they use different languages for the names and so on. So again, you might have to spend some time just on Wikipedia figuring out which party in the vote choice question aligns with which party in the HUGAF data. Again, this is fairly tedious, but it's obviously doable. And once you've done this, you can actually identify which one of the response categories for the vote choice question is a winning party and which one is a losing party. There's one further complication here, and that's the category of others. In most countries, governments aren't composed of too many parties, and most of these parties are fairly large parties, so you usually have them in the main response categories. But in some countries, we have large, many-party governments, where some of the government parties might actually be fairly small parties, and they might fall in the other category. So in countries where this is the case, I excluded the other category. So I just deleted the cases that voted for other, because I couldn't determine whether they voted for the winning party, so one of the parties that actually ended up in government, or some of the other opposition parties. As I said, this only is the case for a handful of countries that has like really large government coalitions. For most countries where governments are composed of maybe 2 or 3 parties, those are usually identified already in the like individual response categories for the vote choice question. Now, as I said, once we excluded the others where it's necessary, then we can simply recode the vote choice question into sort of winner and loser variables. So give it the winner value for the government parties and a loser value for the opposition parties. And then we also finally have our data complete. Everything is linked, everything is harmonized, and everything is prepared for the analysis. So very briefly, just turning to the results of this analysis, we actually find both our indirect effect of political losing on political trust to be present in the data. So we find an indirect effect, an indirect negative effect that is mediated through satisfaction with the incumbent government. So those who voted for a losing party, they are less satisfied with the incumbent government, and they are in turn also less trusting of the political institutions. And in the same vein, those who voted for a losing party, they think the electoral process was generally less fair than those who voted for a winning party, and they in turn again are less trusting of the political institution. And this second indirect effect, so the one that's mediated through perceptions of electoral fairness, that is in fact moderated by the quality of elections. So in countries that have a high quality of elections, we actually don't find any effect anymore of political losing on the perceptions of electoral fairness. So winners and losers, they both perceive the electoral process as equally fair. While in countries where we have some actual problems with electoral quality, losers sort of see these problems as much more severe than winners. And so we have a difference between winners and losers. We have a gap between winners and losers or to express it differently, we have a negative effect of losing on perceptions of electoral fairness and subsequently on political trust. Now, to conclude, as this is a series about data linking, I feel very compelled to say that data linking does allow us to answer more complex questions on the sources of political trust than if we just use survey data. And of course, sources of political trust or other political attitudes or any other attitudes, in fact. Because other than survey data, if we link our survey data with other data, we can, for example, take into account contextual variables, as in my case, the electoral integrity and also the election outcome. On a substantive note, again, political illusion does dampen political trust. And it does so in part by undermining the confidence in the electoral process, which is, of course, from a democratic theory point of view, is problematic because confidence in the electoral process is one of the key basics of democracy. But, and that's the good news here, it only does so when the electoral process is actually flawed. So in countries where electoral equality is very high, losers don't start making up problems usually. So they do acknowledge that the process was free and fair. And it only when there is actual problems with the electoral process is it that losers do see those problems as more problematic than winners did. So that's it from me. I look forward to your questions. You feel free to ask anything you can think of now, but if you come up with something later, I'm also happy to respond to you if you reach out to me via email. And also do feel free to check out our GESIS consulting services on our website. Thank you very much.